started in China. The Chinese actually created printing. Beforehand, you always had the stone tablets, cuneiforms, things like that, that were not very easily duplicated because they would be a one-time shot. But the Chinese, what they would end up doing is actually taking a block of wood like you see here and carving out their Chinese characters. They would carve them out backwards, and what they would do would be to take a liquid ink, put them over the surface like this, a piece of paper on top of that, rub the two together, and then peel off the paper to give their printing. They would use this over and over again. They could print upwards of 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 copies so that many, many Chinese people could read, could learn, and this is why the Chinese were so inventive, so smart. They came up with all sorts of materials that we use today, things like spices, silk, the noodle. So the Italians were very grateful. They could invent spaghetti and printing. Now, it was only because of an explorer by the name of Marco Polo that the Europeans ever found out about the spices and the spaghetti, the noodles, and all of the rest of it. But they did not find out about this, about printing. The Chinese were very much, Marco Polo was a barbarian. They weren't going to give away their greatest secret, which was printing. So they gave everything else, they traded that, but not printing. So Chinese were very inventive, but in Europe, if they had to duplicate anything, they would use the old-fashioned way in which they would use pen and ink. They would just take the feather from a goose or maybe a crow, they would pluck, they would sharpen it to a point, put a split right up the middle, so that by capillary action, when they dipped, they would actually hold more ink. They could then write out what it was they were trying to duplicate. Just like that. So this would be very long, very tedious to make copies of anything. It could take anywhere from 3 to 5 years to make one book, which meant you were hiring somebody for 3 to 5 years to create that one book. Very, very expensive. It's as if you hired somebody today for 3 to 5 years at a cheap salary of $25,000 a year. So that one book could run you $75,000 to $125,000. I don't think you'd want to go down to your local Borders and say, I'd like a book, please. Not only would it be so expensive, but it would take 3 to 5 years. So you'd go down, you'd give them your $100,000, and they say, come back in 5 years. You wouldn't put up with that. But this is the way they did it in Europe. And the people who did that were mostly the people who worked for the church. These were monks. These were the people who worked for the church. They're the ones who had most of the time to be able to do this. And even still, it still cost a lot, so that very few people in Europe could afford a book or any kind of written piece of material. The kings and queens, who collected all the taxes, got all of your money, could afford them. So, like today, they'd be maybe the politicians. The rich people of the time who would buy and sell things, those people would have all of the books that they would have, that they could get because they had the money. People like Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey, Bernie Madoff. Well, Bernie Madoff's a bad example, but the rich people could afford it. And remember, I mentioned how it was the monks that were doing most of the writing, and the monks were the ones who worked for the church. So it was the church then. So those three groups usually were the ones with the books. The rest of us then were just poor, ignorant peasants and didn't know any better. We just got all our information from word of mouth. But it was in 1450 that all of a sudden a gentleman in Germany came up with this idea, a newfangled idea, of creating metal movable type. Now, a couple hundred years earlier, the Koreans had actually invented movable type, but what they used was relatively soft. It didn't last very long. This gentleman in Germany, Johann Gutenberg, came up with metal movable type. So he was able to cast these letters in metal. Now Gutenberg was a jeweler, and he knew how to work with metals. God bless you. He was able to work with metals, and what he did was he actually took a piece of steel like you see here, and he would take a file and other tools. He would file away on the end of this piece of steel, making the letter that he needed so that he could cast it over and over again. In this case, it's the letter M. But back in 1450, the language back then that was most popular was the church's language, which was Latin. So he made up Latin letters. Once he made up the letter, he could now use this to actually create what he called a matrix to do his casting with. So he could take his punch, he'd take a soft metal like brass, put the two of them together, give it a good hard whack, and he created his matrix to use in his casting process. Now the matrix now he uses, now you can't just pour the metal on top of it because there's nothing to hold it together. So now what he did, he would actually create a two-part molding system, like you see here. These two pieces slide together and create a hole in the middle here, which he called a cavity. This is where he would pour his metal. And being in two parts, he could very easily slide the two parts together depending on the size of the letter he was creating. So it's adjustable. He could take his matrix, put it over the cavity, slide the two halves together nice and tight, making sure everything is snug. The spring now can come and hold the matrix in place. And from the other side now, he pours his molten metal. Now, I mentioned he was a jeweler. He's going to have to cast multiple copies of all of these letters that he's creating. He's not going to use gold or silver because it would be way too expensive. So instead he needed to use a cheap metal. And a cheap metal is lead. That's the main ingredient in what we call type metal. Type metal is mainly made of lead. And we see it right here in this little pot here. This is mainly lead. You want to stop for a moment because I'm going to say hello. That's what this is right here. This is a combination, actually, of three metals. Lead, a second metal, because lead by itself is so soft, it didn't last very long. He added a second metal, tin. That helped harden it up so that it could stand up to the pressure that was going on. And a third metal called antimony. And these three metals are what make up type metal. And another interesting point about this was that he found out that he could also melt these metals, all three of them together, melted at a lower temperature than any one metal by itself. So it only melted at 550 degrees, mere trifle. It's your stove on high. So the next time you're broiling fish, you can be melting metal at the same time. So you can kill two birds with one stone, or two fish. Well, anyway. He also, 550 degrees, also found out that it hardened up very quickly too. Now, this is still hot, that's why I'm wearing the glove, but it hardens up very fast. And that way, he didn't have to sit around waiting very long. After he was done with it, he was also fascinated by the fact that he could take this metal, and if he didn't like what he cast, all he has to do is take it back and melt it back down, okay, to recast his letter. It was not a matter of being the first ecologically minded printer, it was a matter of economics. Using cheap metal lowers the cost. Using a low temperature, it means he can build a smaller fire, lowering the cost. If he casts something that doesn't really look good, he can remelt it easily, it lowers the cost. It's all economics. So now, all he has to do is come around with his casting mechanism in hand, reach into the pot, grab out some metal, pour it in, and, oops, and, okay, no, never mind. He would pour it, and a good typecaster could cast about 2 letters a minute. Just wait. He can now take the spring off, remove the matrix on top, and now we have the top of our letter. Put the matrix to one side. This comes in 2 parts. We take it apart. We have our letter. It does cool down relatively quickly. Now, if I keep casting, this will stay hot longer, but it's relatively warm now. And you'll notice on the surface right here is that letter that we wanted to cast. The square sides allow us to put each letter next to each other. The triangle part here is just part of the casting process. Gutenberg would come along and just snap it off. And he could then take that letter and put it into his 2 cases. He put all of his letters in 2 cases. He put his capital letters in this case up here because the further away, he didn't have to reach for them all that often. He put his smaller letters, his punctuation, and his spacing material down here in the case closer to him so that he could then assemble them using what's called a composing stick. So he could then take each letter and assemble them to make words, the words into sentences, the sentences into paragraphs, the paragraphs into pages, the pages into books, and there you have it. So he put all of his capitals here in the uppercase and all of the smaller letters here in the lowercase. That's where you get the terminology, uppercase letters and lowercase letters. That's how that expression comes about, because of the 2 cases. We also use the expression about minding your P's and Q's. The master printer would admonish his apprentice to be sure to mind your P's and Q's, because once the job was printed, you'd have to put the type back into the case, and the only difference between the letter P and Q, there's the letter P, there's the letter Q. Very quickly, as you're doing things, it's very easy to put the wrong letter into the wrong box. So when you start setting type again, you could be misspelling words left and right. So you mind your P's and Q's. I'm out of sorts. That's a printer's term. Gutenberg, when he was creating all of this, he was not creating type. What he called these little things, he called these sorts. And when you are casting those sorts, you are not getting paid. The printer gets paid only by what he prints. So when he was setting type for a job that was selling seashore, it was Sally selling seashells by the seashore, he might use a lot of S's. And all of a sudden he runs out of the S as he's setting his type. Rats, I have to stop, cast more letters. I'm not getting paid to cast letters, so I'm out of sorts. I'm kind of upset. So that's where that expression comes from. But Gutenberg, not only did he create casting of the letters and all of that, he also had to create the machinery to actually do the printing on. There was no printing press. He had created the whole process. And that machine right over there is a reproduction of what a Gutenberg machine would look like to do his printing. So if you want to turn around,